This is a lecture about logical fallacies in emotional arguments and ethical arguments. A logical fallacy is some sort of error or flaw in logic. Either it's flawed because of its very nature or because of its structure. And of course, good writers make emotional arguments and ethical arguments. By ethical, I mean establishing their credibility as a writer. But it can be easy to fall into some of these logical fallacies to commit some of these errors when you're writing or when you're having a debate. I think it's really important to be able to identify logical fallacies. You might think, well, why do I have to know what specific fallacy this is? Once we have a term for something, though, we can understand it better. We can understand why the argument doesn't hold up, why it doesn't make sense logically. Sometimes I'll have students say to me, well, wait a minute. All of these fallacies that you're talking about here, I see politicians use these fallacies all the time. I see writers commit these fallacies all the time. And while that might be true in academic writing, and I would argue in any sort of discourse, we want to avoid logical fallacies, one, because they can backfire, and two, because they can be dangerous, because they make the reader or the listener rely on emotions. They're not logically sound. So we want to avoid them, and we want to be able to point them out whenever we're watching a speech or reading an op-ed or an article. Let's talk about the first one, the false dichotomy or either-or fallacy. You might have also heard of this as the false choice fallacy. So this is where only two options or a few options are given, but it's possible that there are several different options. If there really are only two options, then it might not be a fallacy. But typically, life is much more complicated. There is more than one option. And also, if the person oversimplifies the two options, that can be the false dichotomy or either or fallacy. So America, love it or leave it, as if there aren't other options. Either we allow Americans to have guns or only criminals will have access to them. There would probably be several other options that could happen. Either you avoid logical fallacies in your essays for this class, or you fail the class altogether. Well, not necessarily. You get a B or a C or a D or an A. So this is the false dichotomy fallacy. You can see how it's catchy, right? This could be easily tweeted or posted on Facebook. In a debate, if somebody is not really listening and not really understanding the argument, it might sound catchy, but to somebody who's thinking in kind of a cool, careful way, they'll say, wait a minute, this is a false choice. This is oversimplifying the options, and it's going to backfire. Let's take a look at the next one, the slippery slope fallacy, which means just kind of what it sounds like. This is when the arguer claims that some sort of chain reaction that usually results in something pretty terrible, usually it's not something good, will happen, but there's not enough evidence for that assumption. So the arguer says, if this one thing happens, then all of a sudden we're going to tumble down all the way to Z. So we're going to go from A to Z, and they haven't given us all the links in those chains, or all the links in that chain. So censorship of obscene material will spell the end of freedom of the press, right? That's a pretty big jump. Now, if the person had gone through the chain and explained the connection between all the steps in the chain, then it might not have been a problem. But right now we're going from censoring some pornography or obscene material to suddenly having no freedom of the press. Let's look at appeal to pity. The appeal to pity takes place when the arguer tries to get people to accept a conclusion by making them feel sad or making them feel sorry for someone. So something like, I know the exam is based on performance, but you should give me an A because all of these terrible things have happened to me, puppy dog eyes, right? And it was really hard to study. While those things may be true, and while it might be admirable that the student has worked really hard despite all of these difficulties, it doesn't change the fact that the grade is still based on performance on the test. So again, appeal to pity can work, unfortunately, when people aren't paying attention, but it's a cheap trick that we don't want to use in academic writing. And when we see rhetoricians use this trick, or maybe it's just unintentional when they accidentally commit this fallacy, we want to make a note of it so that we can challenge it. Bandwagon. So a lot of you who might be sports fans have probably heard of Bandwagon before. It's basically saying everyone else is doing it or everyone else likes this thing. You should too. If you don't, you're kind of a freak. You're kind of weird. So it could be something like patriots do it, Americans do this, everyone's doing it, good people do this, because most of us, when it comes down to it, we want to be liked, we want to be respected. Now it can backfire, right? There are people that don't really respond very well to this fallacy in advertising, but it can work on a lot of people. That's why advertisers use it so frequently. So America runs on Dunkin', nobody doesn't like Sara Lee, like everybody likes these donuts from Sara Lee, everyone in America drinks Dunkin' coffee and eats Dunkin' Donuts every morning. It makes us feel like if we don't, there must be something kind of weird about us. Let's move on to false authority. So in academic writing, we reference authority figures all the time, right? In research papers, or pretty much every paper in this class, we are going to provide support and examples and data and analysis from scholars, from critics, from scientists, from researchers. So of course you want to bring in authority figures. But if you bring in an authority figure who's inappropriate or who's not necessarily an authority on the issue that you're talking about, or if you claim to be an authority figure, just listen to me, believe what I say, but you don't provide any evidence, or even if you do bring in a legitimate authority figure, a scholar on what you're talking about, but you don't explain what their argument is, you just say, this scholar says so, so it must be right, that can be the fallacy of false authority. So I'm a chiropractor, and you should listen to me when I say that COVID-19 is spread when people touch infected surfaces, not when they breathe infected air. So I'm not sure the legitimacy of that claim, but I do know that a chiropractor is different than somebody who would study the respiratory system, right? Or an ER doctor. So here it's an appeal to a doctor, a professional, but a professional that's inappropriate in this example. Also, if there were some explanation of why or what the evidence is, that might be a different story, but right now it's an appeal to false authority. AdHominem or tu quoque, sorry, I don't speak Latin, that's the best I can do. This means against the person or the you too fallacies. These are kind of similar fallacies, so I'm putting them in the same slide. So this means attacking people who make the argument because you think the people are bad or evil or immoral, or saying you're a hypocrite, you did the same exact thing. Now, hypocrisy obviously leaves something to be desired. It's really frustrating, even reprehensible. So I'm not saying you can never bring up hypocrisy, but someone's hypocrisy does not change the legitimacy of the argument itself. First, let's talk about AdHominem with this example. Andrea Dworkin has written several books arguing that pornography harms women, but Dworkin is just ugly and bitter, so why should we listen to her? So obviously you can tell that that is attacking Andrea Dworkin and not her ideas, right? Not her argument. Politicians do this all the time. It's name calling. That's one type of AdHominem attack. We want to avoid it, and we want to be able to call it out or at least make a note of it when we see this happening in a commercial or in a speech or in a text that we're reading in this class even. So here's an example of the you too fallacy. I won't accept your argument because you used to smoke when you were my age. You did it too. So while you could absolutely see a young person saying this to their parents, and maybe the parent is being a hypocrite, that doesn't change the fact that smoking is not good for your health. So the hypocrisy there doesn't change the legitimacy of the argument itself. Another example would be if somebody were to ask a president, well, what do you think about the murders of journalists in this country? And the president says something like, well, do you think our country is so great? If we're not really paying attention, we might think, well, yeah, that's true, right? But to someone who's paying attention, they'd say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't actually address whether or not the murders in the other country were acceptable. So it's one thing to bring up how principles that we have, moral and ethical principles, need to be applied uniformly, right? But it's another thing to use hypocrisy as just a way of deflecting and not addressing the real question head on. Let's take a look at stacking the deck. So stacking the deck, you may have heard this term be used in gambling or things like that. Stacking the deck is when writers show only one side of the debate or leave out something really important. They leave out important evidence or withhold that evidence. So here's an example. Our crackers now contain 10% less sugar. Now, someone who's not thinking that sounds like great. The crackers are now healthier, but maybe what they're not telling you is something like, but we've added in a bunch of salt or a bunch of fat or several other additives. So leaving out one big component or even several pieces of evidence that would help the other point of view. Or someone who's creating a documentary only showing evidence that supports their point of view and leaving out evidence that complicates or challenges their point of view. Or it might even be something more subtle. It might be something like a talk show host who has kind of an agenda, bringing on a speaker who's really engaging and vivacious and impressive to represent one point of view, but then intentionally bringing on kind of a weaker speaker or giving them a time slot that's not as valuable or is not as like in the spotlight to kind of weaken or distort the other point of view. So you can see why these logical fallacies are important to be able to identify, right? And we all commit these logical fallacies, but now when you identify them in your own writing, you can make an effort to change them, to make sure that your argument is logically sound. Or when you're having a debate and you feel frustrated by your opposition and you don't know why, it might be because some of these logical fallacies are being used intentionally or unintentionally. And I'd like you to think about the role of understanding logical fallacies in propaganda, in advertising, in writing, in politics, and also think about the role of these logical fallacies in social media, whether it's Facebook or Instagram. And if you think that having an understanding of these fallacies of emotion and ethics will help you better navigate those online spaces.